The weight of the thing was the first clue. It sat in my gloved hand, a cold, dense disc of brass and enamel, far heavier than any pocket watch had a right to be. The archivist had placed it on the velvet cushion with reverent care, her eyes avoiding mine. "Geneva, 1764, she'd said, her voice a whisper in the hushed vault of the Hermitage's auxiliary collection. A curiosity. But curiosities are light, frivolous. This was an anchor. My fingers traced the face, not to tell the time, but to read a message left in metal. 17. The numerals marched in a perfect, unbroken circle. I, 2, 3, Phi, 6, 7, 9, X, or 17, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 16. Each mark was etched with a precision that mocked the word curiosity. The enamel was cracked with age, yes, but along the hour lines, the 17-hour lines, there was a distinct, smooth wear, a gentle valley, where a thumb had rested, day after day, for decades. This object had been used. It had been needed. I held it to the lamplight and turned the winding key with deliberate care. A soft, intricate ticking filled the silence, a heartbeat from a different age. The single, slender hour hand began its slow, deliberate sweep across 17 stations of a day I could not comprehend. The official tag in the file read, "Decorative piece, possibly ceremonial." Unusual division suggests symbolic or non-standard temporal measurement. It was a masterpiece of dismissal. I am a historian of mechanisms, of the things people build to order their world. I know the mind of a craftsman. The gears inside this case, which I could feel purring against my palm, were not forged for symbolism. They were engineered for exactitude. The escape wheel, the balance spring. Through the loop, their perfection was austere, mathematical. This watch was built to measure a cycle that completed 17 increments per revolution. To claim otherwise was to insult the genius who made it. My heart began a quicker rhythm, matching not the watch's steady tick, but the sudden, vertiginous sense of a door swinging open onto a darkened room. That was where it began, not with a theory, but with a physical truth in my hand. I left St. Petersburg with a fever in my mind, chasing a ghost of time. The research became an obsession, a trail of silent anomalies scattered across the globe like shards of a shattered mirror. In the dim light of the Bologna Municipal Archive, I found the photograph. Torre dell'Orologio, 1888, prior to restoration. The tower was gaunt against a sepia sky, and there, clear as the brickwork, was the clock face, 13 Roman numerals. The single-hour hand pointed at sea. The long shadow cast by the tower stretched westwards, indicating a morning sun. 9 in the morning. But if this were a 24-hour clock, showing the first 13 hours, as a bleary-eyed curator later suggested, then Ike's would be 9 hours after midnight, 9 in the evening. The photograph was taken in full, daylight. The lie was right there, staring back at me. The clock had no AM or PM designation, no second set of numerals. It was a 13-hour day, frozen in silver nitrate. I followed the silence. In London, the records of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers were famously meticulous. But for the years 1880 to 1910, the ledgers were a study in evasion. Page after page of entries for dial refurbishment, movement modernization, bell sequence adjustment for churches and town halls from Cornwall to Aberdeen. The costs were listed, the craftsman named, but the nature of the change was never specified. It was as if the entire profession had silently agreed to rewrite the face of time without commenting on the old face it was replacing. I found a single tantalizing entry from 1892 for work on the church clock in a Yorkshire village. Removal of old chapter ring and installation of new, according to the standard. The old chapter ring. What chapters had it told? The anecdotes were ghosts in the margins. A transcript from a Boston Historical Society meeting, 1901, where an elderly member recalled his grandfather speaking of the old bells at the North Church ringing 15 times at midday. The minute-taker appended a note. Speaker likely confused with commemorative peals. In a French provincial museum, a sundial, labelled 18th century decorative, had 17 shadow lines fanning from its gnomon. When I calculated the angles, they corresponded not to our hours, but to divisions of approximately 84 minutes. The brass was worn smooth along those very lines, polished by the repeated brush of a shadow teller's finger. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a geography. I mapped it. Prague's astronomical clock, with its baffling Babylonian circle. A pre-1900 photograph of St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, its colossal tower clock showing 15 markings. A crumbling Spanish missionary's letter from Mexico, 1740, complaining that the indigenous people divided the night into 9 parts, not our proper 6. A British colonial officer's journal from India, 1855, noting the difficulty of synchronizing the railway timetable with local town clocks that seemed to follow a different count. The sheer, scattered normalcy of these references was the most damning evidence. They were not written as revelations, but as mundane observations. The writers assumed their readers understood. That assumption died sometime around the twilight of the 19th century. The official explanation, when one was ever offered, was always the same: local variation, pre-industrial confusion, artistic license. It was a patina of reason over a crack in reality. But I am an engineer of history. I think in load-bearing walls and tolerances. Let me explain why those explanations cannot hold. Consider the astronomical problem. Our day is a messy affair, 24 hours of 60 minutes each, Babylonian-Egyptian medieval hybrid that doesn't neatly fit the solar year, but it works well enough. Now, imagine a 17-hour day. Each hour would be about 84.7 minutes. Follow this system. Dawn might be at hour what? But within a single season, the relationship between the clock hour and the solar position would slip. Drift. Within months, noon, on your 17-hour clock, would occur in what we call deep afternoon. Agriculture, liturgy, civic life, all anchored to the sun, would descend into chaos within a single growing season. No society based on agriculture, as every society was, could function this way. Therefore, a 17-hour clock was not measuring a solar day as we know it. It was measuring something else. Then, the mechanical impossibility. Clockmaking is the marriage of mathematics and metal. Gear ratios are whole numbers, teeth meshing with teeth. Our 12-hour system derives from factors of 2 and 3, beautifully compatible with the gears that approximate lunar and solar cycles. A gear with 17 teeth meshing with a gear tracking a 29.5-day lunar month is a nightmare of fractions. The accumulated error would be monumental. The watch I held in St. Petersburg, however, kept perfect time for its own system. Its craftsmanship was sublime. Therefore, the system it measured was not an imperfect attempt at our time. It was a different, internally consistent system altogether. Perhaps a system not solely tied to the sun, but to something else. A planetary resonance? A cosmic pulse we no longer acknowledge? Finally, the human scale. Before personal watches, time was public. It was bells. If your town bell tolled 17 times a day, you lived by that rhythm. Bell ringers were guildsmen, paid from municipal coffers. Where are the payroll records for ringers working in 17 shifts? Where are the sermons complaining about the new, confusing 12-hour system? Where is the civic uproar over the cost of replacing every clock in the city? I did the mathematics. A conservative estimate, perhaps 5% of public clocks in Europe and America, showed non-standard divisions. That means over 1,000 major tower clocks needed modification between, say, 1850 and 1910. The labour involved: specialist clockmakers, foundry workers for new bells, masons to alter stone dials, would have been an industrial undertaking of staggering scale. It would have required planning, funding, and coordination across linguistic and national borders. It would have been one of the great logistical triumphs of the Victorian age. And yet, it left no trace in our history books, no proud civic monuments commemorating the great time standardization. Only gaps in ledgers and photographs of towers with ghostly painted-over circles on their faces. The silence was the scream. My search for the epicenter of this silence led me to Strasbourg, to the cool, damp silence of the cathedral archive. The astronomical clock there is a Renaissance wonder, a universe of gears and apostles. The public sees the glorious, gilded face showing our familiar hours. But in a steel drawer, under a sheet of acid-free paper, lay the original architectural drawings from the Habrecht brothers, 1574. They were not sketches, they were engineering schematics. And there, in precise, inked lines, was the design for the primary dial. 13 major divisions. The gear trains were calculated with meticulous annotations for a day of 13 primary units, each subdivided into 6, creating 78 marks per full rotation. The mathematics were elegant, coherent, and entirely alien. A note, sealed in a foundation stone during an 1842 renovation and only rediscovered in the 1960s, read, "Upon the directive of the Central Commission for Weights and Measures, the old dial of 13 faces is removed this day. We install the modern dial of twice 12 in conformity with the imperial standard." The note was filed under miscellaneous restoration notes. I held the photocopy, my hands steady, but my mind reeling. The old dial of 13 faces. It was stated as plain fact, the imperial standard. Not progress, not improvement. Conformity. From the heart of Europe, my gaze swung to the other side of the world. In the British Library, I found the album of a British Army photographer attached to the forces in Beijing, 1860. Amidst images of pagodas and cannon, there was a shot of the drum tower. The great drums were visible, and around the platform, clear in the sharp light, were 15 marked stations. Sir George Macartney's journal from his 1793 embassy confirmed it. He wrote of the frustration of his astronomers, who could not correlate the tower's time signals with their own clocks. The intervals are neither equal nor consonant with any division of the day we understand. They speak of 15 watches, but their commencement seems variable. After the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, the drum tower was restored. Contemporary guides describe it as marking the traditional 12 double hours. The same story, from the Gothic spires of Strasbourg to the imperial heart of Beijing. Documentation, modification, erasure. What took shape was not a conspiracy of men in shadows, but something more profound, a conspiracy of ideology. The 19th century did not invent standardization, it weaponized it. The rise of the nation-state, of industrial capitalism, of global empires, demanded a uniform world. Railroads needed synchronized timetables. Factories needed shift whistles. Global trade needed a single meridian. This was not merely convenient. It was a form of control. To make the world run on a single clock was to dominate its rhythm. And in this relentless drive for order, the old, local, peculiar times had to die. They were not corrected. They were annihilated. The 13-hour day of Strasbourg, the 17-hour cycle of a Geneva watchmaker, the 15 watches of Beijing, these were not errors. They were alternatives, different ways of slicing up reality, of perceiving the passage of light and dark, likely tied to local astronomical observations, agricultural practices, or cosmological beliefs we can no longer decipher. The catastrophe was not a comet or a flood. It was the steam engine and the telegraph wire. It was the idea that there should be one way, and only one way, to measure anything. The reset was the triumph of a new global power that valued efficiency over meaning, uniformity over diversity. The old clock faces were not destroyed because they were wrong. They were destroyed because they represented a different consciousness, a different relationship with the cosmos that was incompatible with the tick of the factory clock and the schedule of the imperial railway. I began to see the architecture of the 19th century with new eyes. The frantic, global renaissance of neoclassical buildings in Washington, New Delhi, Berlin. They weren't just stylistic revival. They were the construction of a new, fake antiquity, a past built to order, to provide a dignified pedigree for the new, standardized world. The great world's fairs, where technological marvels were displayed as the sudden fruit of modern genius, were perhaps also a way to rebrand recovered knowledge, to present fragments of a shattered older world as the brilliant inventions of the new. I sit now amidst my papers, the shadows long in my study. I have no villain, no secret society's minutes. I have only the evidence of absence, the worn gears of a 17-hour watch, the ghostly circles on old photographs, the blank spaces in guild ledgers where an explanation should be. The most terrifying conclusion is not that they changed the clocks. It is that they changed the way we think of time itself. They made it linear, uniform, commodified. They stripped it of its local magic, its variable quality, its connection to specific places and skies. They made us forget that time could be sung in a different meter. The old world isn't buried in mud. It's buried in the assumption behind the question, what time is it? We are taught to ask for a number. We are no longer taught to ask whose time, measured by which sun, counted by what rhythm of this particular valley, this specific sea. I will never know what a person felt when they heard the 17th bell ring from a tower that is now a museum. I will never know what they contemplated in that 84th minute of the hour. That knowledge is gone, systematically scoured from the world by the great, grinding engine of standardization. But the artifacts remain. They are the cracks in the monolith. The 17 marks are still there, on a watch in a vault, on a sundial in a provincial museum. They are a whisper from a world that measured its days differently. They are proof that our way is not the only way, that our time is not the only time. Our reality is a consensus, built on the grave of other, equally valid realities. The project of the 19th century was to make us all look at the same clock. My work is a reminder that other clocks once ticked, in harmony with a different sky. They tried to erase it. They almost succeeded. Now, I pass this evidence to you. This is not the end of an investigation, but the beginning of a reclamation. You stand at the edge of the same silent conspiracy I stumbled upon. The difference is, you are no longer alone, and you are no longer unequipped. The tools for uncovering this hidden layer of our world are not locked in specialist archives. They are in your pocket, in your local library, in the very streets you walk. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to become a cartographer of the forgotten. Start with the lens of your phone, but do not point it at yourself. Point it upwards, at the clock towers in your own town's oldest square. Zoom in. Count. Is it a perfect 12? Or do you see faint lines, ghost numerals, a patched-over stone circle where a different count once ruled? Document it. Photograph it from every angle in the changing light. Then, walk. Walk into your local historical society. Do not ask for the curated tour. Ask for the uncatalogued boxes, the donations from old families, the miscellaneous drawer. Look for the journals, the ledgers, the personal diaries from before 1880. Search for the words bell, chime, hour. Look for confusion, for complaint, for any mention of a change that disrupted the rhythm of life. Transcribe those passages. Share them. Visit the oldest cemetery. Find the gravestones of clockmakers, bell ringers, town criers. What dates are on their stones? Does their period of service end abruptly in the 1880s, 1890s? A generation of timekeepers made obsolete. This is a distributed investigation, a global effort to reconnect a severed nerve, create a new record, a digital archive, not of the official history, but of the anomalies. A simple website, a shared folder, a social media tag. Call it The Forgotten Hour, Ghost Dial, Old Count. Upload your images, your transcriptions, your location. Connect your local anomaly to mine, and mine to a stranger's finding on another continent. The pattern will emerge, not as a theory, but as a crowdsourced map of the reset. But go deeper than observation. Relearn how to tell time by the sun in your own latitude. Feel how the intervals of light and dark do not neatly fit 24 identical boxes. Question the very meter of your life. Why do we work in 8-hour blocks? Why is an hour 60 minutes? These are not natural laws. They are the fossilized decisions of the standardization machine. By questioning them, you begin to dismantle its control. They succeeded because they convinced everyone to look in the same direction, at the same authority, for the same time. Our resistance is to look everywhere else, to look at the overlooked, to listen for the echoes in the silence they left behind. This is more than historical curiosity. It is an act of cognitive liberty. Every strange dial you document, every forgotten bell schedule you recover, is a brick removed from the wall of manufactured consensus. You are not just finding old clocks. You are recovering old ways of thinking, of being in a world that was once far more nuanced and locally intelligent than the monolithic, ticking grid we inhabit today. So, start tonight. When the standardized news ends and the manufactured silence of the modern night begins, step outside. Look up at the stars, not as a backdrop, but as the original clock face. Then tomorrow, look at the tower in your town square with new eyes. The truth they tried to extinguish is waiting, not to be believed, but to be seen. And now you know how to see it. Find your anomaly. Document it. Connect it. Reclaim the time they stole. The 17th hour is waiting to be rediscovered. It begins with your first, questioning glance upward. Go. The pocket watch from Geneva did not leave me. Its image was burned into my sight, the peculiar heft of it a permanent memory in my palm. But a photograph, a ledger entry, a worn sundial, these were shadows. To understand the mind that made the watch, I needed to understand its guts. I needed to hold its heart. This required a different kind of trespass, not into archives, but into the sanctums of private collectors, the kind of men who own, not for love of history, but for the thrill of possessing the unique. It was a sour world of whispered auctions and non-disclosure agreements, but it was where the uncatalogued, the denied, the too embarrassing for museums artifacts eventually gathered dust. I found him through a chain of discreet referrals. A man named Alistair Finch, who resided in a fortified manor on the misty moors of North Yorkshire. His collection was not for public eyes. He was a keeper of contradictions, he said, over a crackling telephone line. I told him I sought a contradiction that ticked. There was a long silence, then an address and a time. Not an hour, a time. "Come at the dimming," he'd said. His study was a tomb of polished oak and glass. Finch himself was a gaunt man, all long fingers and watchful eyes. He did not offer pleasantries. "You are the one asking about the wrong clocks," he stated. I nodded. He unlocked a cabinet made not of wood, but of what appeared to be black slate, and drew out a velvet-lined tray. Upon it lay 3 timepieces. One was a smaller cousin to my Hermitage watch, 16 divisions this time, the enamel a brilliant midnight blue. The second was a bizarre bracket clock, its face a complex series of concentric rings with 13, 17, and 24 markings interlinked, as if translating between systems. The third was a simple, brutal thing of iron and crude glass, a single hand over a dial of 15 notches, like something from a monastery workshop or a ship's hold. "None are decorative," Finch said, his voice low. "Test them." With tools finer than a surgeon's, I opened the 16-hour watch. The world of the archive fell away. Here was the truth, laid bare in brass and steel. The gear train was a symphony of prime numbers. The main wheel had 170 teeth. It drove an intermediate pinion of 10, which meshed with a wheel of 102, which engaged the escapement. The ratios were calculated not for the 43/200 seconds of our day, but for a day divided into 16 units, each further divided by the intricate dance of the other wheels into what I could only assume were their own minutes and seconds. It was a complete, closed, and perfect system. The gears showed microscopic wear, the oil long evaporated to a crystalline dust. But the pivots were true. This was not a prototype. It was a product. The bracket clock was the Rosetta Stone. Its 3 hands moved in a slow, discordant waltz. The outer hand, tracking the 24-hour ring, completed a revolution in what my modern wristwatch confirmed was precisely 24 hours. The middle hand, on the 17-hour ring, took 17 of our hours to complete its circuit. The innermost, on the 13-hour ring, took 13. They were all driven from the same central gearbox, a labyrinth of axles and differentials that made my head ache to contemplate. It was a converter, a translator of time. This clock did not ask you to choose a system. It showed you all 3 at once, proving their simultaneous mechanical reality. Finch watched me, a faint smile on his thin lips. "It asks a question, does it not?" he murmured. "Not what time is it, but which time do you require?" The iron clock with 15 hours was the most disturbing. Its mechanism was crude but sturdy, the gears hand-filed. It had the aura of a tool, not a gentleman's possession. It was a clock for a workplace, a farm, a barracks. This was not elite knowledge. It was commonplace. I thought of the staggering implication. If such a clock existed for mundane use, then the society that used it ran on that 15-hour pulse. The blacksmith's apprentice, the milkmaid, the foot soldier, they all ordered their lives by this 15 count. The scale of the forgetting became apocalyptic. Finch allowed me to take detailed photographs, measurements, gear counts. "They will call them forgeries," he said, as I packed my tools. "They always do, when the world does not fit the box. But forgery is an act of creation. No forger on earth would invent a fully functional, mathematically coherent gear train for a time system that never existed. The mind seeks patterns it knows. This," he said, gesturing to the tray, "is a pattern we have been taught to unknow." Armed with this physical proof, I changed my tactic. I stopped looking for clocks and started looking for the people who might have lived by them. The modification period, 1850, 1920, was within living memory for some of the very old. I began a pilgrimage to nursing homes, remote village pubs, the cottages of the last children of the Victorian age. Most looked at me with polite bewilderment. Time was time. Clocks were clocks. But in a sun-parched town in rural Provence, I found her. Her name was Elise Verdun. She was 103. Her memory was a patchwork, but certain pieces were sewn in with brilliant, unchanging thread. She sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking a field of lavender, her hands like fallen leaves in her lap. I showed her a drawing of a clock face with 17 numbers. I did not ask a leading question. I simply placed it before her. She stared for a long time. Then a finger, brittle as a twig, rose and tapped the numeral Seventeenth. La cloche lourde, she whispered. The heavy bell. My grandfather. He was a guetteur, a watcher, in the hills, for the fires. Her French was old, the accent thick with local stone. He spoke of his turn, not by the sun but by the bell. He said his watch was 3 turns of the grande aiguille to the cloche lourde, 3 turns of the big hand to the heavy bell. She traced the circle on the paper. The big hand, it went around, not like today, slower. The hours were longer, more of them in the night. He said the night had its own count, the veil, the watch. It was 8 parts. She shook her head, frustrated. The new mayor, when the railway came, he changed the bell. Pour la modernité. My grandfather was angry. His watch was useless. A pretty lie, he called it. He kept the old one in a drawer, would not look at it. Said it told the true time, and the true time was no longer welcome. It was a fragment, a single frayed thread, but it was human confirmation. The heavy bell that marked a 17th division, a longer hour. A night divided into 8 or 9 parts, not 2 times 6. A man whose internal rhythm, whose very duty, was synced to a system that was then declared obsolete, illegitimate. A pretty lie. From there, the fragments coalesced into a chilling narrative of enforcement. In the National Archives of a small Baltic state, I uncovered police reports from 1898 concerning public order disturbances in a market town. The cause? A faction of older citizens, led by a retired clockmaker, had refused to acknowledge the new clock installed on the town hall. They continued to conduct business at the old hours, causing confusion and arguments. The clockmaker was arrested for inciting discord and obstructing administrative order. His tools were confiscated. The report concluded that after his brief imprisonment, the disorder ceased. I found no record of what happened to his tools or to the old clock faces he undoubtedly kept. In a Cincinnati newspaper archive, a small notice from 1873 announced an ordinance requiring all public clocks to be synchronized to the railroad standard upon penalty of fine. Another from Philadelphia, 1889, detailed a grant from a civic improvement fund to help churches offset the cost of upgrading their tower clocks. The language was always one of progress, improvement, standardization, never of erasure. But the effect was the same. The old count was criminalized, then bankrupted, then forgotten. The most potent tool of this erasure, I realized, was education. I tracked down school primers and textbooks from the 1870s through the 1910s. In a geography textbook from 1882, a chapter on the nations of Europe and their customs contained a passing, almost dismissive line. In some remote districts, peculiar local methods of reckoning the hours may still be heard of, but these are swiftly giving way to the rational and uniform system necessary for commerce and brotherhood among nations. By the 1905 edition, the line was gone. The past had been streamlined. In arithmetic books, word problems now exclusively used the 12-hour clock. Children were no longer even presented with the concept that another arithmetic of time could exist. They were being trained in a new reality, their minds shaped to fit the standardized world as naturally as a foot fits a factory-made shoe. I began to see the reset not as a single event, but as a process with distinct phases. First, documentation and ridicule. The old systems were noted as quaint, backward, provincial. Then, coercion and enforcement. Laws and economic pressure made them impractical. Then, replacement. The physical infrastructure was changed. Finally, and most crucially, education and memory holding. The next generation was taught the new system was the only system that had ever logically existed. The past was edited, not with a malicious red pen, but with a quiet, relentless omission. The scope of the coordination still baffled me. How did a mayor in Provence get the same idea as a city council in Cincinnati? The answer, I found, was in the publications of the new international bodies. Journals like the Standardizer and Proceedings of the International Congress for Uniformity of Weights and Measures dripped with the fervour of a secular religion. Articles passionately argued for a single global time, not just for trains, but for the moral and intellectual improvement of mankind. Diversity was chaos. Uniformity was peace, progress, and profit. These journals were circulated among administrators, engineers, and businessmen worldwide. They provided the script, the philosophical justification, and the technical specifications. The local officials were not taking orders from a shadow cabinet. They were reading the same gospel and zealously implementing it in their own parishes. It was a bottom-up revolution driven by a top-down ideology, a virus of conformity that found willing hosts in every ambitious mayor and modernizing minister on the planet. I returned to my study, the whispers of Elise Verdun and the cold precision of Finch's gears swirling together. I had moved from the what to the how. The mechanism of the forgetfulness was laid bare. It was bureaucratic, ideological, and terrifyingly effective. But a final, grim question remained. The why was clear for the standardizers: control, efficiency, power. But what about the lost systems themselves? What were they for? A 17-hour day is astronomically nonsensical for a solar-based society. But what if the society wasn't solely solar-based? My research pivoted one last time, from history and mechanics to archaeoastronomy and folklore. I began to cross-reference the anomalous clock counts with ancient calendar systems, mythological cycles, and even the peculiar intervals of certain resonant planetary frequencies. The number 17 appeared in puzzling places, in the ancient Sumerian king lists, in the step sequences of some Neolithic tomb layouts, in the intervals between certain harmonic beats in the Earth's own magnetic resonance, a modern discovery called the Schumann resonance. 13 was the number of lunar cycles in a solar year, more or less. 15 and 16 were factors in complex astronomical cycles used in Mayan and Hindu cosmology. A horrifying, thrilling possibility dawned. These weren't arbitrary numbers, they weren't mistakes. What if each system was a local tuning fork, a way of keeping time not just with the sun, but with a subtler local rhythm of the Earth itself, or with a celestial cycle we no longer deem relevant? What if the watch with 17 hours was designed to keep its bearer in sync with a specific geophysical or planetary pulse that was considered vital to health, agriculture, or spiritual alignment? The old folklore was littered with taboos about disturbing hill folk or cutting certain trees at the wrong hour. Not our hour, but an hour defined by a different clock. The catastrophe, then, was not physical, but perceptual. The rise of mechanistic science declared such pulses superstition. The cosmic was reduced to the celestial mechanics of visible bodies. The subtle was discarded in favor of the grossly measurable. The global time system was the ultimate triumph of this worldview. It severed humanity's last formal communal link to those subtler rhythms. We were unplugged from a complex living network of time and plugged into a single, dead, industrial meter. This was the true loss. Not a conspiracy to hide a past empire, but a systematic campaign to annihilate a mode of consciousness. The old clocks were not measuring a different kind of day. They were evidence of a different kind of mind. A mind that listened where we now only look. A mind that felt time as a quality, woven from many threads, solar, lunar, terrestrial, perhaps even stellar, rather than a quantity to be sliced into identical, indifferent units. I held the photographs of Finch's clocks. They were not anomalies. They were relics of a drowned continent of human understanding. The silence in the archives was not the silence of nothingness, but the silence after a scream has been stifled. The world had been forcibly retuned to a single shrill note, and the rich, complex chord of the old time was now only a vibration remembered by the very stones of the towers and by the failing memory of the very old. My work was no longer investigation. It was archaeology of a phantom limb, the ghost of a sense we once possessed, but can now only infer from the empty space it left behind, and the peculiar, purposeful machines built to serve it. The final piece did not come from an archive, a collector's vault, or the lips of the very old. It came from the mud. A friend, an archaeologist, working a routine rescue dig along a shifting riverbank in the Rhineland, sent me a photograph. It was a disc of corroded bronze, about the size of a saucer, dredged from a layer dated to the early 1600s. It was not a clock. It was a template. Around its edge were 17 precisely drilled holes. Radiating from the center to each hole was a finely engraved line, and beside each hole, a numeral. I through 70s. It was a master pattern, a clockmaker's guide for laying out a 17-hour dial. It was not a singular, curious object. It was tooling, proof of production. This was not a philosopher's model. It was the blueprint from which multiple faces could be stamped, filed, engraved. It turned the singular anomaly into evidence of an industry. Holding the high-resolution image on my screen, I felt the last comforting pillar of mainstream explanation crumble. This was not about artistic license or regional quirks. This was about tooling up for a market that demanded a specific, non-standard product. Someone had commissioned this master pattern. Craftsmen had used it. Apprentices had learned from it. Merchants had sold the clocks it produced. A population had bought and used them. This small, dirty circle of bronze was the smoking gun. It connected the exquisite watch in the Hermitage to the crude iron clock in Finch's collection through the cold, practical logic of supply and demand. A demand our history books claim never existed. With this, my perspective shattered and reformed for the last time. I had been thinking like a historian, tracing effects. Now I had to think like the people who lived it. I assembled all the evidence, the gear ratios, the folklore fragments like Elise's, the police reports, the school books, the tooling, and tried to walk in their world. Imagine it. You are born in a small German principality in 1750. Your town's great clock has 17 marks. The bell rings 17 times a day. Your father's pocket watch has 17 hours. This is not strange. It is the world. The hours are longer, yes. The rhythm of the day feels different. The periods of work, prayer, and rest are not crammed into 2 sets of 12, but flow through a longer, slower count. The night is not a binary opposite of day, but has its own longer, deeper increments, perhaps 8 or 9 of these longer hours. Your body, your community, the very crops in the field are tuned to this rhythm. It is not just a measurement, it is the metabolic pulse of your life. Then, the change does not come as a revelation, but as a pressure. First, from travellers who speak of the new time used by the trading companies. Then, from pamphlets published by learned societies in the capital, speaking of universal hours and rational order. Then, an ordinance. The town council declares that for the sake of commerce and modernity, the great clock must be modified. There is grumbling. Your grandfather is furious. But the new railway is coming, and with it, jobs. Resistance seems not just stubborn, but foolish. The clockmakers arrive. They board up the famous old face. For weeks, the familiar bell is silent. Then, the scaffolding comes down. There is a new face, 12 numbers, twice. The bell rings on a new, quicker, more frantic schedule. Your father's beautiful watch is now a conversation piece, a useless heirloom. You buy a cheap, mass-produced 12-hour watch from England to get a job on the railway. Within a year, the old rhythm feels like a dream. Within a generation, your children laugh at their great-grandfather's broken watch. They are taught in school that the hour has always been 60 minutes, the day always 24 of them. They are taught there is one way to measure, one way to think, one rational path of progress. The 17-hour day becomes, at best, a fairy tale about silly, backward ancestors. At worst, it is forgotten entirely. The master pattern is thrown into a river, where it lies for centuries until the water decides to give it back. This was not a cover-up of a cataclysm. It was something more intimate and more devastating, a lobotomy of cultural memory. The reset was a psychological campaign that leveraged real economic and technological change, the railroad, the telegraph, the factory, to sell a new, simplified reality. The old, complex timekeeping systems weren't hiding advanced technology. They were the advanced technology. The technology was a sophisticated, localized understanding of time as a multidimensional phenomenon. The catastrophe was the decision that such understanding was irrelevant to the modern project of empire and industry. I looked at the world outside my window with new, mournful eyes. Every synchronized clock, every digital display blinking identical numbers across time zones, was not a symbol of unity, but a monument to that great forgetting. We had traded a living, pluralistic tapestry of time for a sterile, global spreadsheet. We gained punctuality. We lost poetry. We gained coordination. We lost connection. The conspiracy, then, had no central room where villains smoked cigars and plotted. It was woven into the very fabric of modernity. The they was the emergent property of a new worldview that worshipped uniformity, efficiency, and control. It was in the engineer who designed the railway timetable without a thought for local bell cycles. It was in the bureaucrat who drafted the ordinance for clock standardization. It was in the textbook writer who omitted the old ways to present a clean, linear history. It was in us, every time we accepted the given time without question, every time we dismissed an anomaly as a coincidence or a forgery. My journey had reached its end. I had followed the evidence from a single watch to a global pattern of suppression. I had moved from the what to the how to the why. The story was complete, but a story is a seed. It is meant to be planted, not stored in a vault. This is where you enter. This is not my conclusion. It is your starting point. I have provided the map, but the territory is all around you. The work of remembrance is not done in libraries like this one. It is done in your streets, with your eyes, on your time. Your call to action is this: become a keeper of the discordant note. First, look up. Your mission begins the next time you walk through your city's historic core. Stop. Look at the clock tower, the church steeple, the old factory cupola. Don't just glance, study it. Photograph the clock face with the zoom lens you carry in your pocket. Count. Are the numerals evenly spaced? Is the circle perfect? Or do you see faint, ghostly lines where numbers once were? Is there a patch of newer stone, a slight discoloration in the brickwork, suggesting an older, larger dial was once there? Your eye is now trained to see the scar tissue left by the reset. Document it. Note the location, the building. This is primary fieldwork. Second, listen in. Visit your local historical society, your town archive. Ask to see the earliest photographs of your main streets. Look past the people and the carriages. Look at the buildings in the background. Zoom in on every clock face you can find. Scour early town council minutes for mentions of clock repair, bell replacement, or standard time ordinance in the late 19th century. Read the old local newspaper digitizations. Search for bell and hour and change. You are looking for the moment of fracture in your own community's memory. Find it. Third, speak out. When you find something, a ghost dial, a puzzling ordinance, a diary entry complaining about the newfangled hours, you do not file it away. You share it. Use the hashtag, the forgotten hour. Create a post with your image, your transcription, your location. You are not alone. A scattered community of others is doing the same from Kuala Lumpur to Lisbon to Quebec City. Your single, local anomaly is a data point. Connected to others, it becomes a map, a living, crowd-sourced atlas of the reset that no authority can bury. This digital archive is our collective counter-memory. Finally, and most importantly, rethink time. This is the deepest rebellion. Once a day, step away from all clocks. Go outside. Feel the sun's arc. Notice how the light changes, not in 1-hour blocks, but in a continuous, flowing gradient. Try to sense the day not as a countdown, but as a cycle of qualities. Fresh dawn, bright zenith, long shadow, deep night. Relearn the simple, subversive art of telling approximate time by the sun and shadows. In doing so, you are not rejecting modern life. You are reclaiming a layer of your own perception that was deliberately numbed. You are remembering how to feel a rhythm older and more fundamental than any clockwork. They standardized time to make the world manageable for empire and industry. Our task is to rewild it, to rediscover its lost contours and varied beats. The 17th hour is more than a number on a forgotten dial. It is a symbol of all the rich, complex, local truths that were paved over to create the flat, monotonous highway of official history. You hold the proof now. The evidence is not just in my words, but in the very stones of your hometown. The conspiracy of silence is broken not by a shout, but by a million whispers of rediscovery from a million ordinary people who chose to look up and question the face on the clock tower. The reset happened because people were persuaded to look away, to forget, to accept. The reclamation happens only if we choose to look, to remember, and to question. So go, look up, listen in, speak out, reclaim your time. The forgotten hour is waiting to be found, and it starts with you.